over the history of the Spider-Man franchise, there has been a wide variety of different costume designs that have appeared over the history of the comic franchise. And one video game which helps emphasize this quite well is Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4. So this game was released a couple of years ago, and with the expectation that there will be a sequel made for the PS5, I feel like it was probably time that I look at what is my top 10 favourite costumes from the Spider-Man PS4 video game. Now this list isn't necessarily about abilities, one or two might have abilities, but the majority of the costumes on this list is there for their aesthetic look and also their legacy throughout the Spider-Man franchise. So let's begin the top 10 and see what is at the start of the list. Number 10 on this list is the Stealth Big Time suit. So for me, this is one of the more intriguing suit designs in the game, mainly because of the colour scheme. It is black with a small hint of green. So this gives it a little bit of a Spec Ops type, design, which is appropriate because this suit helps improve your stealth capabilities in stealth missions with its ability called blur projection. So it creates a distortion field that can obscure you from non-alerted enemies, so it can really help out in stealth missions. And also it looks like something that would be like in the Spec Ops video games, so I thought this was a quite intriguing take on the Spider-Man costume design. Number 9 is the homemade suit from Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, I'm not going to lie, by the end of this video you'll probably notice a little bit of a theme developing in this top 10. And the theme kind of kicks off with this suit. So the homemade suit is the suit that we originally saw Spider-Man in when he was first introduced actually in Civil War, before he got the Tony Stark suit. We then see Peter Parker wear the suit again when he's battling Vulture at the end of the film after losing that suit from Tony Stark. I personally think this suit actually looks pretty good in the Spider-Man video game. It looks like one which most people could actually make at home, albeit one or two adjustments, and I just think the way it looks in the video game, I do want to do a couple times, come back to using the suit now and again. Number 8 is the Spider-Man Noir suit. So for me, this is definitely one of the most unique Spider-Man costumes that has ever been created in the history of the franchise. Why? Mainly because of its comic. So the Spider-Man Noir series is one of the most unique Spider-Man comics that's ever been created, mainly because it's set in the 1930s and it's also set in black and white. So this Spider-Man was a bit more gritty than most of the Spider-Man that we will see on this list. Well, pretty much all of them actually. Mainly because I think in actually one or two of the costumes he actually does resort to using weapons. So it's got a little bit more of a Batman feel than Spider-Man in some of the comics. And also the other reason is the way this character was portrayed in the Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions video game. Using the original voice actor, so it does have a special place for me. And also, just looking at the costume, it's very un-Spider-Man-esque, so it could definitely be an interesting costume to use for stealth missions. Number 7 is the Spider-Man 2099 suit. So this is one of the few cases where this isn't actually a Peter Parker. This is actually Miguel O'Hara. So this was a scientist that worked for Alchemax in the year 2099. Someone actually poisoned him with some kind of drug. So then he tried and used the DNA device to try and remove that from him. I believe it was called Rapture. But then someone corrupted the machine, so then his DNA became 50% Spider. As a result, he decided to take up the name of Spider-Man, reviving it from the heroic days of that universe. So then he dons the Spider-Man 2099 costume. The design itself is actually probably one of my favourite ones that's ever been created in the franchise. The way it just looks like aerodynamic and sleek, while still having a little bit of a... Well, actually the mask looks a little bit like a Spawn design, the way it's designed. And I think personally it's one of the more unique costumes that we've seen from the Spider-Man franchise. Number 6 is the Scarlet Spider. So, referring back to what I just said in the previous entry about 2099, this is actually a costume which was used by many different Spider-Men over the years. The most famous obviously being Ben Reilly, the original Scarlet Spider, but then Peter Parker actually wore this for a time along with characters such as Joe Wade, the Scarlet Spiders, and Kane Parker. So this is one of the few costumes which actually has multiple iterations of characters wearing the single identity as the Scarlet Spider. Also, for me, the original Scarlet Spider design is still one of the most iconic in the history of the franchise, even though it probably isn't as iconic as some of the other ones on this list. Number 5 on this list is the Anti-Ox suit. So this is actually the only original Spider-Man costume from the video game which made this list, but personally I do think it is the best one. So spoilers coming up ahead. So this costume is unlocked at the end of the game when you encounter Doc Ock, and you have to use some of the technology that you used to make the arms. So I do like the way this costume is designed. It's got a little bit of a metal exterior on the outside, and I do like the colour scheme of yellow and black. And yes, personally I think this is the best costume, the best original costume from the game. And yes, I think it's personally one of my favourite suits in general to use.
It'll be the one with the flashing red and blue lights.
Number 4 is the Stark suit from Spider-Man Homecoming. So, as I alluded to earlier with the homemade suit, the main reason he was wearing that again was because this suit had been taken away from him, from Peter Parker, from Tony Stark. So this suit was the first proper suit of Spider-Man in the MCU, so it was obviously going to have a fairly significant place on this list. The colour scheme is relatively close to the classic Spider-Man, albeit with a little bit of a variation on the layout. But the colour scheme of red, black and blue is still the same. And yes, I do like the design of this costume. Also, just as a little fun fact, the spider drone that you get when you activate the special ability of the costume is probably overall my favourite ability in the game to use for a Spider-Man suit. But yes, obviously this was going to have a fairly high place on the list, considering that this was the first proper MCU Spider-Man suit. Number 3 is the Iron Spider suit from Avengers Endgame and Infinity War. So this is the suit that Peter Parker is given by Tony Stark in Avengers Infinity War. We were actually teased this suit at the end of Homecoming, but it was only in Endgame and Infinity War where Spider-Man actually uses it. So this is another suit which has a pretty cool ability in-game itself because of the spider arms. So the spider arms can help take down big guards immediately without having to like stun them or web them up or electrocute them or something like that. So it's definitely one of the more fun abilities. Not quite as fun as the spider drone that we saw in the previous entry, but yeah, I think it's a pretty good one. Also, I do think the design is one of the more unique that Spider-Man has had, and also it's kind of a cinematic twist on one of Spider-Man's most iconic costumes in the form of the Iron Spider. Because of course the Iron Spider was featured in Civil War quite prominently, and has also had some different universes with iron themed armor. So I do think because of that, that's why it has earned a place in the top 3 on this list. Taking the runners-up spot on this list, we have the most recent addition to the Marvel Spider-Man game, and that is the upgraded suit from Spider-Man Far From Home. So the reason why I actually picked this over the Stark suit is just plainly because I actually think the colour styling is actually better. The way that the costume is designed, I think the blue, or at least in game, looks a little bit too bright. Having it changed to black, I actually think is a pretty good change. It's also a little bit of a twist on the classic Spider-Man costume. So as a result, I actually do think that it's a better looking costume. Also, one other factor could be that it is the most recent Spider-Man costume, so that probably has a part to play in the fact, and whether we'll see this in Spider-Man 3 remains to be seen, but I do think it's probably mainly because of that it's the current Spider-Man costume at the time of recording this video. That's why it's so high on this list. However, there is one Spider-Man costume which is higher up on this list, and in all honesty, by now, you've probably worked out what costume that is. Number 1. The Websuit, aka the Sam Raimi suit. So this suit to this day is still the most iconic film version of the Spider-Man suit, and it's not hard to see why. The Spider-Man trilogy back in the early 2000s helped kick off the current trend of superhero films along with the X-Men films. So Spider-Man 2 obviously is still regarded as one of the greatest superhero films ever made, and yes, it's not hard to see why. So that's probably one of the big reasons why this costume was the most requested costume out of any Spider-Man costume for this game. So when this costume was introduced as a free update, a lot of people instantly switched to it, and I think it was really cool of Insomniac to get the licensing to this, because I suspect it was probably a massive pain in the neck to negotiate with Sony and the studios to try and get access to this costume. And of course now well, depending on what happens, it's possible that this costume could make a comeback, because if anyone didn't see the Morbius trailer, there was actually a teaser to the Sam Raimi suit back in the day. So it's possible that this, never know, the Sam Raimi universe could see a comeback in the future. But yes, this is easily one of the best looking costumes in the game, and of course being a free update also is quite nice. And yes, ever since it got introduced as a free update, this has pretty much been my go-to Spider-Man suit ever since. I do switch now and again to other suits, but I always switch in the end back to the original Spider-Man costume, the Sam Raimi suit.